What kind of man would set fire to his own village just to demoralize an invading army? What kind of ruler would turn his entire kingdom into a weapon, sacrificing everything his people had built to create a wasteland so horrific that even battle-hardened soldiers would flee in terror? The year is 1462. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, is marching north with 60,000 men to crush a small, rebellious principality called Wallachia. The Ottoman Empire has never lost a campaign of this scale. They expect swift victory, plunder, and the usual submission of yet another European territory. Instead, they find something that will haunt their nightmares for generations: a scorched and desolate land where every village burns, every well is poisoned, and the roads are lined with forests of impaled bodies stretching as far as the eye can see. They are about to discover what happens when desperation meets calculated brutality, and why the name Vlad Dracula will echo through history as both savior and monster. Before diving into these forgotten accounts of medieval warfare, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world. Today, we're going to uncover what Vlad the Impaler really did to his enemies, based on first-hand accounts from Ottoman chroniclers, Venetian ambassadors, and Vlad's own letters. What you're about to hear goes far beyond the Hollywood vampire stories to reveal military tactics so brutal they redefined psychological warfare itself. When news reached Vlad that Mehmed's massive army was approaching, he faced an impossible choice. His forces numbered perhaps 20,000 men against the Sultan's 60,000. Open battle meant certain annihilation. Retreat meant abandoning Wallachia to Ottoman rule forever. But Vlad chose a third option that no one expected. He would turn his entire kingdom into a weapon. According to Laonikos Chalkokondyles, the Byzantine chronicler who documented these events, Vlad began implementing what he called the Great Burning weeks before the Ottomans arrived. Every village in the army's path was evacuated and destroyed. Not just abandoned, but systematically obliterated. Houses were burned to their foundations. Crops were set ablaze in the fields. Livestock was slaughtered and left to rot, poisoning water sources. Wells were filled with stones and corpses. Granaries were emptied and torched. Even the trees were cut down to deny the invaders shade and shelter. But what happened next reveals the true genius of Vlad's desperation. He didn't just destroy resources, he weaponized the very act of destruction. Ottoman soldiers advancing through Wallachia found themselves marching through a landscape that seemed cursed. The air reeked of rotting flesh and burning wood. Every stream they encountered was polluted with decomposing animals. The smoke from burning villages blotted out the sun, creating an apocalyptic atmosphere that unnerved even veteran warriors. Tursun Bey, Mehmed's own chronicler, wrote that the army began suffering from dysentery and fever within days of entering Wallachian territory. But this wasn't accidental. Vlad had deliberately contaminated water sources with diseased corpses, turning basic survival needs into potential death sentences. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Ottoman soldiers, accustomed to living off conquered lands, found themselves carrying all their own supplies while marching through what felt like the aftermath of divine judgment. Morale plummeted as men began to believe they were campaigning in hell itself. Contemporary Venetian diplomatic reports describe Ottoman desertion rates that were unprecedented in the empire's military history. Soldiers were abandoning their units, not because of enemy action, but because the landscape itself had become unbearable. But Vlad's scorched earth tactics were just the beginning of his campaign of terror. What he did next would transform psychological warfare forever. As Mehmed's weakened army approached the Wallachian capital of Targovishte, they encountered something that defied comprehension. According to multiple chroniclers, the road leading to the city was lined with a forest of wooden stakes, each bearing the impaled body of an Ottoman prisoner. But this wasn't random cruelty. Saxon chronicler Thomas Ebbendorfer documented that these displays stretched for miles, with thousands of bodies arranged in precise patterns that forced advancing troops to march through corridors of death. The stakes varied in height, creating undulating waves of corpses that seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. What made this even more horrifying was the deliberate artistry of the arrangement. Taller stakes-bearing high-ranking officers were positioned at strategic intervals, creating focal points that drew the eye and emphasized the fate of Ottoman leadership. Lower stakes-bearing common soldiers filled the spaces between, creating a carpet of death that made normal military movement impossible. Ottoman chronicler Enveri described the psychological impact on Mehmed's troops. The sight struck terror into hearts that had conquered Constantinople. Veterans who had stormed the walls of the greatest city in Christendom found themselves weeping like children at the spectacle before them. But what happened next reveals the true sophistication of Vlad's terror tactics. He didn't just display dead enemies. He created living monuments to suffering that served multiple strategic purposes. Recent prisoners were impaled while the army watched, demonstrating that this fate awaited anyone who opposed Wallachian resistance. The process was deliberately slow, allowing victims to remain conscious and screaming for hours while Ottoman soldiers were forced to listen to their agony. The positioning of these displays near water sources and rest areas meant that Ottoman troops couldn't avoid them even during necessary stops. Every meal was eaten within sight of rotting corpses. Every drink of water was taken while listening to the moans of the dying. The stench alone was overwhelming. Thousands of decomposing bodies in the summer heat created an atmosphere so toxic that many soldiers became violently ill just from breathing. But they couldn't retreat without facing the same fate themselves. Contemporary accounts describe Ottoman soldiers covering their faces with cloth soaked in perfume, but nothing could block out the sounds and sights that surrounded them. The psychological damage was immediate and lasting. But the forest of stakes was only preparation for Vlad's most infamous weapon. While impalement was known throughout the medieval world, Vlad transformed it from simple execution into sophisticated psychological warfare. His methods were so refined and systematic that they became legendary throughout Europe and the Ottoman Empire. According to Vlad's own letter to Hungarian King Matthias Corvinus, discovered in the Hungarian National Archives, he developed specific protocols for different categories of victims. Common soldiers faced quick impalement designed to kill within hours. Officers endured slower procedures that could last for days. Envoys and high-ranking prisoners received special treatment designed to maximize both their suffering and the psychological impact on witnesses. The technical sophistication was horrifying. Stakes were carved to specific dimensions that would pierce vital organs slowly while avoiding immediate death. The positioning required anatomical knowledge that Vlad had acquired through years of practice. Victims remained conscious and able to speak for extended periods, allowing them to serve as living warnings to other potential enemies. But what made Vlad's impalement truly distinctive was its integration into broader military strategy. These weren't random executions, but carefully planned psychological operations designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. When Ottoman envoys arrived to demand tribute, Vlad used their treatment as an opportunity to send precise messages about Wallachian resolve. The famous incident with the Turkish ambassadors who refused to remove their turbans in his presence demonstrates this perfectly. Rather than simply executing them for disrespect, Vlad ordered that their turbans be nailed to their heads with small iron spikes. This punishment was specifically designed to mock Ottoman religious customs while demonstrating that Wallachian Christians would not submit to Islamic authority. The envoys were then impaled using the slow method, but positioned so they could see each other suffering. This ensured that their final hours were spent not just in physical agony, but in psychological torture as they watched their companions endure the same fate. The bodies were displayed prominently near the palace gates, where subsequent diplomatic missions couldn't avoid seeing them. The message was clear. This is what happens to representatives of the Sultan's authority in Wallachia. Contemporary Ottoman records show that diplomatic contact with Wallachia virtually ceased after these incidents. Mehmed's administration struggled to find volunteers willing to serve as envoys to a ruler who treated diplomatic immunity as an opportunity for creative torture. But what happened next shows how Vlad extended his terror tactics beyond foreign enemies. Vlad's use of impalement wasn't limited to Ottoman prisoners. He systematically applied these methods to govern his own people, creating a climate of fear that made rebellion unthinkable and ensured absolute obedience to his authority. Contemporary Saxon accounts from Brasov describe public impalement ceremonies in Wallachian towns, where citizens were required to attend and witness the fate of those who challenged Vlad's rule. Merchants who cheated customers, nobles who questioned his policies, and peasants who failed to pay taxes all faced the prospect of slow death on wooden stakes. The German chronicler Antonio Bonfini documented that Vlad would sometimes order mass impalements of entire families, including children, when household heads were found guilty of betraying state secrets or supporting Ottoman infiltration. These events were staged as public spectacles designed to demonstrate the consequences of disloyalty. But the most chilling aspect was the bureaucratic efficiency with which these executions were conducted. Vlad established formal procedures for determining which method of impalement was appropriate for different crimes. Administrative records show that his court maintained detailed guidelines specifying stake dimensions, positioning techniques, and display protocols for various categories of victims. The psychological impact on Wallachian society was profound and lasting. Contemporary church records indicate that confession rates increased dramatically as citizens sought absolution for thoughts and actions that might be interpreted as treasonous. The mere possibility of accusation was enough to modify behavior throughout the population. Venetian merchant accounts describe traveling through Wallachian towns where public squares featured permanent impalement sites that were used regularly for both foreign prisoners and domestic criminals. These installations served as constant reminders of the consequences of challenging Vlad's authority. The international reputation that resulted from these policies served Vlad's strategic objectives by discouraging both internal rebellion and foreign invasion. Potential enemies understood that challenging Wallachian independence meant facing not just military resistance, but psychological warfare that could break even the strongest wills. But even this systematic use of terror was only preparation for Vlad's most innovative cruelty. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Vlad's campaign was his use of mutilated survivors as living weapons. Rather than killing all prisoners, he would systematically maim captured Ottoman soldiers and send them back to their own forces carrying messages written in their own blood and scars. According to Tursun Bey's chronicle, these survivors would arrive at Ottoman camps with their noses and ears cut off, their faces branded with crosses, and their tongues partially severed, so they could still speak, but only with difficulty. Each carried specific information about Wallachian defensive preparations and Vlad's intentions for captured enemies. But what made these living messengers so effective wasn't just their physical condition. It was the stories they brought back about what they had witnessed during their captivity. These men had watched fellow prisoners being impaled slowly over the course of days. They had listened to the screams of dying comrades and observed the systematic torture that awaited anyone unfortunate enough to fall into Wallachian hands. Their testimony was more powerful than any propaganda because it came from their own terrifying experiences. The psychological impact on Ottoman military morale was devastating. Veteran soldiers who had never known fear in traditional battle began experiencing what modern psychologists would recognize as symptoms of trauma merely from hearing these accounts. Unit cohesion deteriorated as soldiers became increasingly reluctant to engage in operations that might result in capture. Officers reported difficulty maintaining discipline as men actively sought ways to avoid combat duties that might lead to encounters with Wallachian forces. The timing of these releases was carefully calculated for maximum psychological impact. Mutilated prisoners would arrive at Ottoman camps during meal times or evening rest periods, ensuring that their testimony would spread throughout the entire army before morning. Contemporary accounts describe Ottoman soldiers unable to sleep after hearing detailed descriptions of impalement procedures and watching the physical evidence of Wallachian cruelty hobbling through their camps on maimed feet. But the most insidious aspect was how these living messengers undermined Ottoman confidence in their own strength. Even a massive, victorious army began to feel vulnerable when confronted with evidence of an enemy willing to inflict such systematic cruelty on captured soldiers. The strategic genius of this approach lay in its self-reinforcing nature. Every survivor who returned to Ottoman lines carried not just information, but psychological infection that spread fear and demoralization throughout the ranks. The cumulative impact of Vlad's terror campaign achieved what conventional military resistance could never have accomplished. According to multiple contemporary sources, Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, eventually ordered a retreat from Wallachia without achieving any of his strategic objectives. Enveri's Ottoman Chronicle describes the decision as driven by circumstances that made victory impossible, despite overwhelming military superiority. These circumstances weren't battlefield defeats, but the complete breakdown of army morale under psychological pressures that traditional military training had never prepared soldiers to handle. The retreat itself became another opportunity for Vlad to demonstrate the effectiveness of terror as a weapon. Wallachian forces harassed the withdrawing Ottomans using hit-and-run tactics, while constantly threatening captured stragglers with immediate impalement. The psychological scarring extended to Mehmed himself, who, according to Venetian diplomatic reports, became obsessed with finding ways to neutralize Wallachian resistance, without exposing his forces to the psychological warfare that had devastated his previous campaign. Contemporary accounts suggest that the Sultan never again personally led campaigns against Wallachia, delegating subsequent operations to subordinates, while remaining safely distant from the psychological battlefields that Vlad had created. But what happened next reveals the long-term strategic impact of Vlad's methods. Ottoman expansion into Central Europe slowed significantly as the empire's military leadership became increasingly cautious about campaigns that might involve similar psychological warfare. The reputation that Vlad established through his terror tactics influenced Ottoman strategic planning for decades. Military advisors counseled against operations that might provoke similar responses from desperate European rulers who might adopt Wallachian methods of resistance. The historical impact of Vlad's terror campaign extended far beyond his immediate conflict with the Ottoman Empire. His systematic use of psychological warfare influenced military thinking throughout Europe and established precedents that would be studied and emulated for centuries. Contemporary military treatises began analyzing the effectiveness of terror as a force multiplier, noting how relatively small armies could achieve strategic objectives against vastly superior enemies through systematic application of psychological pressure rather than traditional battlefield tactics. But the human cost of these innovations was staggering. Modern historians estimate that Vlad's campaigns resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 people, many of whom died through prolonged torture rather than quick military execution. The transformation of impalement from simple execution into sophisticated psychological warfare represents one of history's most disturbing examples of human creativity applied to systematic cruelty. Vlad didn't just kill his enemies. He turned their deaths into weapons that terrorize the living. The documentation that survives from this period provides unprecedented insight into how terror can be weaponized as state policy. Ottoman chronicles, Venetian diplomatic reports, Saxon merchant accounts, and Vlad's own correspondence create a comprehensive record of systematic brutality applied with scientific precision. The international reputation that resulted from these campaigns ensured that Vlad's methods would be remembered and studied long after his death. Military academies throughout Europe included analysis of his psychological warfare techniques in their curricula. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on cultural memory. The stories of Vlad's cruelty spread throughout Europe and eventually evolved into the vampire legends that made Dracula immortal in popular imagination. The historical Vlad Dracula was far more terrifying than any fictional vampire because his methods were real, systematic, and devastatingly effective. He didn't just inspire fear, he weaponized it. The question we began with was what kind of man would sacrifice everything his people had built to create a weapon of pure terror? The answer reveals something disturbing about human nature and the extremes to which intelligent individuals will go when facing impossible circumstances. Vlad the Impaler wasn't simply a sadistic monster. He was a strategic genius who recognized that conventional warfare offered no hope against overwhelming enemy superiority. His innovations in psychological warfare were born from desperate necessity and refined through systematic application of human cruelty. The effectiveness of his methods can't be denied. A small principality successfully resisted the most powerful empire in the world through tactics that broke enemy morale without requiring battlefield victories. Vlad proved that terror could be more effective than military strength when applied with sufficient creativity and determination. But the cost was measured in human suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. Thousands died, agonizing deaths to serve strategic objectives that could have been achieved through diplomatic compromise or tactical retreat. The legacy of Vlad's campaigns reminds us that the line between strategic brilliance and monstrous cruelty often depends on perspective and historical context. His methods were simultaneously the salvation of Wallachian independence and the systematic torture of countless human beings. The accounts we've explored today come from contemporaries who witnessed these events firsthand. They document not just the facts of Vlad's cruelty, but the psychological impact it had on everyone who encountered it, from Ottoman soldiers to Wallachian civilians to foreign diplomats. Understanding this history helps illuminate the dark potential that emerges when desperation meets intelligence and unlimited power. Vlad's story serves as both inspiration for resistance against overwhelming odds and warning about the human cost of systematic brutality. If you found this exploration of medieval psychological warfare as compelling as I did, make sure to subscribe for more content that uncovers the disturbing truths behind historical legends. Comment below to let me know which of Vlad's tactics you think most undermined Ottoman morale. Was it the scorched villages, the forests of impaled bodies, or the mutilated survivors sent back as living warnings? The message that Vlad carved into history wasn't written in stone. It was left to fade on wooden stakes, scattered across the landscape of a small principality that refused to surrender. But the psychological scars he inflicted on his enemies proved more durable than any monument, echoing through centuries as a reminder of what happens when desperation unleashes human cruelty in service of strategic genius.